Hello there. In this video, I'm going to analyze some parallels between common arguments against abortion and arguments against redistribution. And I'm going to argue that these arguments fail for very similar reasons. In the original, simple versions of these arguments, the premises might seem somewhat plausible on the face of it, but upon reflection, once we revise them in some needed ways, I think that they are far from obviously true. And in fact, I don't think we're justified in accepting them, at least absent substantial arguments. Okay, so let's just get straight to the arguments. Right? Here are the first versions. The first is an argument against abortion. Premise A1, abortion is murder. Premise A2, murder is always wrong. Conclusion, so abortion is always wrong. Right? And now we have an argument against redistribution. Premise R1, redistribution is theft. Premise R2, theft is always wrong. Conclusion, so redistribution is always wrong. Okay, now these are valid arguments. The premises entail the conclusion, so in order to evaluate them, we need to ask, should we accept these premises? Now again, I think just looking at these premises, they might strike you as somewhat plausible at first, but I think actually they can be challenged in various ways. First, take a look at the first premise in each. Okay, it's tempting to see these as purely factual premises. Abortion is murder, redistribution is theft. And it's tempting to see the second premise in each argument as the moral premise, right? Murder is always wrong, theft is always wrong. But I actually think that's a mistake. The first premises in each argument are actually also moral premises, or at least they have a hidden moral component. And we need to make that explicit in order to see if we should really accept these premises. Okay? So what is the moral component in these premises? Well, notice we're using these words, murder and theft, right? But we intend to use them in a morally loaded sense, okay? We don't mean them purely in a legal sense. Why is that? Well, we can imagine an evil dictator taking us over and rewriting all our laws so that it only counts as murder when certain people are killed, right? Similarly, we can imagine this dictator in rewriting all the laws about property and saying that everything belongs to some small group of people. So whether something counts as murder in the legal sense is just a matter of what the current laws say, right? Again, if this dictator said killing certain groups of people who fall under certain, categories is not murder, then it wouldn't be murder in that legal sense. Clearly, that's not the sense that matters to morality. And similarly, if this dictator wrote laws that say that everything belongs to him, taking stuff from him would be theft in the legal sense relative to those laws, but it wouldn't be theft in the morally loaded sense necessarily, right? So what are these morally loaded senses? Okay, well, the words murder and theft are being used in these arguments in the following senses. Murder is not just any killing, but killing in a way that violates rights, okay? It's killing in violation of rights. And similarly, theft is not just taking, right? Or taking in a way that violates the current laws. It's taking in a way that violates people's property rights, okay? Just property rights. So these are the senses of these two words we need in order to make at least the second premises plausible in each, right? Murder is always wrong, theft is always wrong. If those words, murder and theft, were only being used in the legal sense, then these premises are clearly false. If the evil dictator writes a law that says, destroying a blade of grass or cutting down a tree is murder, well, then it's murder in the legal sense relative to those laws, but it's not clear that that matters to morality. Similarly, again, if he writes that everything belongs to him, taking stuff from him would be theft in a legal sense relative to the current laws, but not in a sense that would make it wrong necessarily. Okay? So we really do need these morally loaded senses. We need murder to mean killing in a way that violates rights, and theft to mean taking in a way that violates rights. So let's plug in these definitions into these arguments in order to see if the arguments are as plausible as they were before. Okay? So this brings us to the second versions. Premise A1 prime, abortion is killing in violation of rights. Premise A2 prime, killing in violation of rights is always wrong. Conclusion, so abortion is always wrong. And then the second argument, premise R1 prime, redistribution is taking in violation of rights. Premise R2 prime, taking in violation of rights is always wrong. Conclusion, so redistribution is always wrong. Okay? Now, in the earlier version, the simple version, the premises might have been somewhat plausible, but now that we've filled in exactly what we mean by murder and theft, I think that the first premises are not obviously true. So let's look at premise A1 prime, okay? Abortion is killing in violation of rights. Is that true? Well, in order to justify this, you're going to have to show that fetuses have the relevant rights, and furthermore, you're going to have to show that getting an abortion violates those rights. Well, why is that? Well, you might think that in ordinary circumstances, if another human ended up somehow living inside your body, it wouldn't count as murder to remove that human from your body, even at the price of killing them, right? If the only way to remove this other human who got implanted in your body somehow is to kill them, it's not obvious that you're violating their rights by killing them, okay? I'm not saying you're definitely not violating their rights. I'm just saying it's very far from obvious that you are violating their rights. In other words, it's far from obvious that they have the right to live inside your body without being killed, okay? So those are some things you're going to have to show to justify premise A1 prime. You're going to have to show that fetuses have the relevant rights, to not be killed, and that this right to not be killed applies even when they're infringing on your bodily autonomy, when they're living inside your body. Okay? Now let's take a look at premise R1 prime. This says redistribution is taking in violation of rights. Now, in order to justify premise R1 prime, you're going to have to argue that people have a right to control all the resources that they would have in the absence of redistribution. Right? So you're going to have to argue that whatever the just theory of property rights is, it entails that billionaires have a right to control vast amounts of resources in light of poverty, in light of other circumstances. You're going to have to argue that there are no sorts of restrictions or limitations on property acquisition that would justify redistribution. You're also going to have to argue that the current distribution of resources is not a result of massive rights violations that would justify some form of redistribution as rectification, okay? And I think that's a pretty tall order. All right, so I think both premise A1 prime and R1 prime are open to challenges, but now I want to talk about the second premise in each argument, okay? Premise A2 prime says killing in violation of rights is always wrong, and premise R2 prime says taking in violation of rights is always wrong, all right? Now, I think these premises might actually be open to some counterexamples. So let's think about the first one. Killing in violation of rights is always wrong, right? Premise A2 prime. Is that the case? Well, what if there's an evil tyrant who forces you to kill an innocent person and says if you don't, he's going to torture and kill that person along with 100 other people? We can also make it 1,000,000 if that helps. This is very similar to a case brought up by philosopher Bernard Williams. But the important thing is, I'm not saying necessarily that it wouldn't be wrong to kill that person, even though it violates their rights. I'm just saying it's far from obvious that it would still be wrong, right? You'd be killing an innocent person, you'd be violating their right to life, but it's not obvious that it'd be wrong to do so given the alternative, right? 1,000,001 people, including that person, being tortured and killed, okay? So that just shows that there might be some exceptions to the wrongness of killing, even when it violates people's rights. Okay? Now let's look at this second premise in the other argument. Taking in violation of rights is always wrong. I think this one is also subject to counterexamples, and these counterexamples are a lot more plausible. What if your child is going to die of thirst unless you steal a bottle of water from a house when no one's home? Okay? I think in that case, most people are probably going to agree it's not wrong to steal the bottle of water. Okay? Now, we're assuming this bottle of water really did belong to whose ever home it was. They had a right to it. This other person, this parent, did not have a right to it. However, even though they're taking this bottle of water in a way that violates people's rights, it still seems like it's not wrong to do so. Okay? So this goes to show that there are some exceptions to the wrongness of taking, even when it violates people's rights. Right? So we've seen that the second premises in both arguments might be subject to counterexamples. So let's revise the arguments one more time. Right? We're going to need to replace the second premises in each with premises that have a built-in exception clause to them. Okay? So that brings us to the final versions. Premise A1 prime prime, abortion is killing in violation of rights that is not in circumstances C1 through Cn. Premise A2 prime prime, killing in violation of rights is always wrong except in circumstances C1 through Cn. Conclusion, so abortion is always wrong. Right? So in the second premise here, we've had to include our exception clause. These are the exceptions, right? These are the cases in which it's not wrong to kill, even when it violates rights, okay? We're not clear what exact cases will be in here, but if we ultimately think there will be some, they are in here, right? And so obviously we're going to have to include this exception clause in the first premise as well, and we're going to have to say that abortion does not fall into any of those exceptions, right? That's the only way that this conclusion follows. Okay, let's take a look at the second argument. Premise R1 prime prime says redistribution is taking in violation of rights that is not in circumstances D1 through DM. Premise R2 prime prime, taking in violation of rights is always wrong except in circumstances D1 through DM. Conclusion, so redistribution is always wrong. Okay, so in the second premise, we've had to add exception clauses for when it's not wrong to take, even in a way that violates rights, right? So the water bottle example falls into this class of circumstances, D1 through DM, and maybe there are a whole lot others, okay? And then obviously in the first premise, we're going to have to add that redistribution does not fall into these circumstances, right? The circumstances that are the exception to the wrongness of taking, even when it violates people's rights. Okay, so now that we have the final versions here, I think that the first premises in each are now far from obviously true. Okay, let's think about what you would have to do to justify premise A1 prime prime first. You're going to have to, as I said before, argue that fetuses have the relevant sort of rights. You're also going to have to argue that they have a right to live inside the mother's body without being killed, right? Furthermore, you're going to have to argue that even if they have this right, that this is not one of the exceptions to the wrongness of killing, even when it violates rights, okay? I think that's a pretty tall order. That's a lot to defend in this premise, and that's why I think we're not justified in accepting it, at least absent substantial argument. All right, now let's take a look at premise R1 prime prime. What would we have to defend in order to show that this is true? It says redistribution is taking in violation of rights that is not in circumstances D1 through DM, right? So first, you're going to have to argue that redistribution really does violate people's rights. In other words, you're going to have to defend your theory of property rights and show that, again, there's no restrictions, no limitations on property acquisition, and that there's no good historically based reason to redistribute for, rights violations, for that sort of thing. Furthermore, you're going to have to show that redistribution is taking in violation of rights that doesn't fall into this class of exceptions. So if we thought that taking this bottle of water, even when you're violating the property owner's rights, is not actually wrong, right, to save your child who's drowning of thirst, then we might also think it's plausible that redistribution in order to bring people out of poverty, right, to make sure that people aren't dying from lack of health care, to make sure that people are getting the opportunities they need from education, that sort of thing. You're going to have to show that this sort of redistribution doesn't fall into these exception clauses. And it seems like if taking the bottle of water is one of the exceptions, then why shouldn't bringing people out of poverty or saving people from dying for lack of medical care also not one of the exceptions, right? So I think once we get to these final versions of the arguments, I think that the first premises in both are just far from obviously true, and we're not justified in accepting them absent substantial arguments. And so that's why I think these arguments, at least as they are, fail to justify their conclusion. Okay? But if you think these arguments can succeed, if you think the first premise in each can be defended, then I wish you good fortune in the culture wars to come. And now begins.